Disunity is death in Australian politics.
We've learned our lesson, though.
There's a fair go for those who have a go.
23 minutes to 10. Barrie Cassidy hosts Insiders on Sunday mornings on ABC TV. He talks to us on a Thursday and has very generously agreed for his final election campaign, and as someone pointed out, mine too, he's very generously agreed to come in early today and take your calls. It's an exceptional opportunity. You don't often get the chance to lock horns with Barrie Cassidy, host of Insiders. 1300 222 774. 1300 222 774. Barry, good morning to you. How do you see the state of the parties as we approach Saturday's voting?
Well, it does look as if it's just very difficult to find the way through for the coalition. Even based on what I've been told from within the Liberal Party on their tracking polls, and they say they're doing better in Victoria than anybody realises. Just to go through it very quickly, the seats that they concede are tough are in Queensland are Ford, Dixon and Petrie. In New South Wales, though, they say Gilmore and Robertson, to Labor that is, not Reid. They don't concede that Reid is gone. But in New South Wales, of course, you've got Cowper and Warringah, 2 seats, and maybe Farrer that could fall to independents. So that's where they get into trouble in New South Wales. You know, it could be, a net loss of 5 seats because of the independents.
Some of those independents are basically very conservative independents who will support a coalition if it comes to a hung parliament.
Yeah, though Warringah not so conservative. Climate change is the
Farrer
case.
Very much, though.
Very much so, yeah.
Yep.
And Cowper, Rob Oakeshott supported.
So just to clarify, this is Peter Dutton losing his seat, Tony Abbott losing his seat, and Susan Lee, who is the minister former health minister, is out in Farrer, and here in Victoria, which is where we've
just quickly on the other, and then I'll get to Victoria because that's the most interesting. South Australia, no change. Tasmania, maybe 2 gains, but certainly Braddon, you would think, for the coalition. And in WA, the coalition is saying only Swan is the only one that they concede is tough. They think they can hold on in Stirling and Hasluck. So that's their best case scenario, right? But that leaves them with 71 seats. Mm-hmm. Now you might say, okay, we can put together a minority government with 5. Problem with that is Farrer, Cowper, Warringah, if they lose those 3, it's not 71, it's 68. And in my book, I think Flynn, Reid, there are seats like Stirling and Hasluck, I think it'd be very difficult for them to win. So, but even on their best case scenario, they're not there. Whereas the ALP, you can see how they get to 76 and then beyond.
So here
in Victoria, now this is the interesting thing about Victoria, because clearly the polls suggest big gains for Labor in Victoria. The problem with that is that the swings seem to be happening in areas like Higgins and Flinders, but not quite enough. You need the Labor needs 7% to win those seats, and they're not quite getting there. If they had swings like that in Latrobe and Deakin, for example, they would win them easily. But they're not getting them. They're not getting those swings in those areas. They're getting them in the sort of more climate change aware areas. And so the Liberals that I've spoken to insist they can win Latrobe and will win Deakin. So the only ones they concede is that they might lose Chisolm and Dunkley, but that's it. Now
Dunkley is down around Frankston, and
Dunkley's already notional Labor, and yet they say so that goes. Chisolm goes, but Coorangamite
down on the surf coast,
and I'm getting this from both sides, that Coorangamite could well stay with the government, even though it's notionally Labor.
So what does it all mean? There's the prospect of a hung parliament, there's this prospect of independence, there's this prospect of balance of power being held by a group of people whose main interest is seeing action on climate change but disagree on practically everything else.
Yeah, the interesting thing with when Zali Steggall said, well, I would support the coalition provided they accommodate me on climate change, and Tony Abbott said, well, you see, she'll support Labor because they've got the better policy on climate change. And to describe it as Labor the better policy, I guess what he meant by that is the better policy in terms of winning over Zali Steggall. I don't know. I mean, that's for him to explain it, but that's precisely what he said in that interview with the Sydney Morning Herald.
Word for word, and it was quoted and written up in The Age. Yeah. 1300 222 774. A lot of the campaign has been sort of quasi-presidential, and we've seen in particular Scott Morrison making a virtue out of necessity necessity because some of his senior ministers decided to jump ship, and some of the others are, well, you're not going to see him campaigning with Michaelia Cash or Melissa Price, the Environment Minister. They've been in witness protection. But the contrast with Labor has been there, but whether that matters or not will depend entirely on the outcome, will it not?
Yeah, I think it matters a bit because it's, it's basically he's trying to make a virtue out of necessity. It was the disunity thing and problems with ministers that led to this arrangement. Julie Bishop not being on the scene any longer was one factor. Josh Frydenberg being kind of nailed to his electorate was another. So in the end, he had to build it, and they built it around Scott Morrison because he was ahead in the. They looked at what the focus groups were saying. They were saying that disunity is their big problem, but Labor's problem is doubts about Bill Shorten. So and he leads in preferred Prime Minister. In the end, they took that too serious. They made too much of that. Being preferred Prime Minister usually goes with the Prime Minister of the day, and in any case, Bill Shorten, through the campaign, has narrowed the gap to 7 points. Now, that's not much, in terms of a Prime Minister against an opposition leader. So I think they threw a lot at that, but in the end, I don't think it was much of an advantage at all.
Full board of calls. People are desperate to talk to you, so I'll keep my comments very, very brief. Very quickly, Greens, Nats, there's a real blowback. The Nats being perceived in many areas as now the party of big agribusiness, including multinational agribusiness and the mining lobby, rather than the party of family farmers that they used to be. Yeah,
they're in trouble. I mean, you've got Farrer, Cowper and possibly the Mallee, areas where the Nationals could go backwards. And now you've got this breakdown in the agreement between the Liberals and the Nationals in New South Wales. It hasn't had much attention. If this broke separate from an election campaign with nothing else to compete with, it would be a big story.
Yep.
But their preference deal is broken down in the Senate. Jim Molan, who's the bit of a darling of the right wing of the
former
Liberal Party,
senior military officer.
Yeah, he was pushed down to number 4, unwinnable position, and so he's urging people to vote below the line for him. Now, some prominent Liberals have been caught out promoting that idea, and so the Nationals said, right, all bets are off. We want now our Nationals to vote below the line as well to get the number 3 up. So that's, Barnaby Joyce described it as, he said, the Libs have fired the first shot in a war, and this could be utterly chaotic. Well, that's
interesting.
Not
it's coming from someone who's not the leader of the party, is the other point to make. And the Greens?
The Greens have got... Look, let's see what happens here, because they're in for a fight in some seats like McNamara, Higgins,
formerly Melbourne Ports. Higgins, they're talking themselves up in Higgins, and Julian Burnside is being talked up in Kooyong against Josh Frydenberg. Yeah, look, it might be status quo for them. They might make a gain or two. Let's see what happens on Saturday. Lots of callers, starting with Rusty in Richmond. Morning to you, Rusty.
Morning, guys. Before I ask the question, I'd like to state that you're both statesmen of the Australian news media, and you'll both be missed enormously.
Take all the time you like, mate.
Sorry, what was we're both what? Salesman, did you say?
Statesmen. You guys are great. You hold them to account, no matter which side. It's brilliant.
That's kind of you. But your question, Rusty, for Gary.
Now,
for Barry.
As a religious Insiders fan, my question is around the Back to You Barrie throwback.
Yeah.
I'm personally a fan of when Mike Bowers teams up with Warren Brown, but also with the late Leslie Nasser. Which one over the years has caught you by surprise, or was your favourite, Barry?
Well, Warren Brown was a personal favourite for a long time. He hasn't been as available over the last years, but he would be the guy we'd go to for the big one at the day after the election. And I'll never forget the one when they camped out overnight, or at least pretended they did, camped out at Parliament House on the lawns. And, what they did, I'm not giving away secrets here, they have a sign-off for a win or a loss on either side. But Warren Brown was, it's great. Sammy Jay's doing it this week, and I don't know whether you saw his piece last night, but it was outstanding. So we're looking forward to Sammy's contribution on Sunday.
Good on you, Rusty, and thank you. Andrew's in Brisbane. Morning to you, Andrew. How come you're choosing to listen to Melbourne radio when you're in Brisbane?
I've lived in Melbourne for a very long time. I've been in Brisbane for about 10 years, but I never miss a Faine show or anything. I think it's a brilliant show.
That's very kind of you. Yeah. Now, you've got Barrie Cassidy hanging on your every word.
Yes, no, Barry, congratulations on Sydney as well. It was just, I flew down to see you. It was brilliant.
Oh, terrific. Thanks for doing that.
You were at the Writers' Festival, were you?
Yeah.
We should explain, Barrie will be excruciatingly embarrassed here, but he got a standing ovation from a packed Sydney Town Hall at the Sydney Writers' Festival.
If he hadn't left the stage, we'd still be there, Clay. Listen, mate, my question is, look, because I'm 65 myself, and I'm just wondering, is this the way we're going to go now, this presidential stuff, or the way that they're telling lies? Do you think this is the new normal, or can we get back to truth, or do we have to make rules about it?
Yeah, look, there've been complaints about these being presidential for a long time. This time it was self-declared presidential. This is the first time that I've heard a political leader say it is about me versus the other guy, right? Straight out. No nuancing that one. That's the way that Scott Morrison chose to do it. I don't think that will be the way it'll happen again in the future, and I hope it doesn't work that way, because it's not about that. It's about a whole range of things. Policies, number one. Number two, local factors and who you're voting for at the local level. On the other issue about, the lies and stuff, it's more the misleading that goes on. And I think as journalists we have a responsibility, and we probably didn't do it. But I'll give you one example that what just became accepted wisdom, housing taxes and retirees taxes. Now, the retirees tax, I know, from the feedback I'm getting, it's really hurt Labor in a lot of areas. It's not actually a retirees tax. What they've done is taken away a tax concession. That's not the same thing as a tax. But I don't think Labor...
They've failed to prosecute that argument. They've never cut through.
I don't think Labor fought back hard enough on it. I don't think they probably thought, look, the more we fight back on it, the more we draw attention to it. I don't know. But I think they've taken a bit of a hit on that.
All right, text messages. Annie in Kooyong says, please, Barrie, change your mind. I set the alarm every Sunday to watch Sundays. It's the most expensive infrastructure debacle ever, says Mike from Woodend, and it's hardly been mentioned, the NBN. Does Barrie think electorates are being misled by deceptive political advertising? And Bob Menzies once said, if I give every working class family a chance to own their own home, they won't become communists. In his time, home ownership went from a quarter to 3/4 of the population. He also said, I'm not worried about the rich. The rich can look after themselves. I'm focused on middle Australia. And that kept them in power for 20 years. Just a smattering of your text messages. Ross has called from Western Victoria. Ross, good morning to you.
G'day, John and Barrie.
Welcome.
Hi, Ross.
Thank you. I want to make two quick points. One is about family trusts. I'm rapt to see Labor address this, because I know my brother, he earns a good income. And he told me he saves $5,000 a month in tax by having his affairs tied up in a family trust, which I think is pretty extraordinary. And it also enables...
You're a bit jealous, are you, Ross?
No, not at all. I'm quite well off. I'm quite happy.
Okay.
And it also enables him to get around childcare benefits. The other thing I wanted to raise, which no one's picked up in this election so far, is the Liberals have campaigned on Labor being high taxing. But essentially that's what the Liberals have done over the last 4 years, or 3 to 4 years. So I earn about $100,000 a year, roughly, and in the last 3 years, I used to get from family tax benefit A and B, which I philosophically oppose anyway, but I used to get about $8,000 back a year. And under the government for the last 3 years, that's essentially disappeared.
Yep.
So in effect...
Is there a question in this, Ross?
Well, I think it needs to be addressed to the Liberals.
Okay, well, let me just also... Barrie, before you answer, today's Financial Review, page 3... New tax office statistics show there are approximately 60 self-managed super funds with balances in excess of $50 million and a handful with balances greater than $100 million. And there are 75 self-managed super funds with balances between $20 and $50 million. And in all, that's $75 billion sitting in a tax-sheltered wrapper, nothing to do with retirement savings, but being given concessional tax rates. It's less than 1% of all the self-managed super funds, but that is staggering.
Yeah, Ross's question was on family trusts, and the reason that family trusts haven't been an issue is because neither side plan to do anything about it right at the moment. On the issue, though, of taxes and who taxes the most, is it the Coalition or Labor? And there's just an accepted wisdom that, well, of course, it's Labor, but the RMIT and the ABC recently did a fact check on this and on the most recent governments. and they found tax to GDP ratio, because there's hardly a better way to compare it. The highest was John Howard, but then he introduced a GST. After that, it was the ATM government, Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison, then the Rudd-Gillard, and the smaller, in terms of tax to GDP, was Hawke and Keating. So the facts don't kind of support the proposition, but I nevertheless think whenever Scott Morrison says, Labor doesn't know how to handle money, I think it probably resonates with a lot of people, because it's sort of ingrained into the minds of many people now.
Simon in Rowville, good morning to you. You're through to Barry.
Good morning, John and Barry. Barry, I was wondering, has anyone given consideration to the idea that MPs, after the election is called, should not be allowed to use their taxpayer-funded electoral offices and their taxpayer-provided, funding to run their election campaigns? I mean, all this garbage went on about the red shirts in the state election a few years ago.
But that's the advantage of incumbency. Are you saying it should be taken away?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a ridiculously unfair advantage of incumbency. And if they're going to do that, they should provide funding for people who aren't incumbent.
Barry?
Yeah, and the other advantage of incumbency, quite apart from that, is the ability to be able to shower the electorate with real money and not just promises. And look what's happened. Look, this is...
But candidates who are not the sitting member have been handing out big cheques, even though they've got no basis or authority or even budgetary approval to do so.
Provided they're candidates for the government, for the coalition party, they can
Nats have been doing it, Libs have been doing it, Georgie Downer did it in Mayo in South Australia.
But look, all this sort of pork barrelling, I think, is short-sighted, because it helps them this time, but it just makes matters worse down the track. Why do you think these independents are emerging where they are? The most toxic message that independents have is make a safe seat marginal, because they look over across the fence and they see what's happening in these independent seats, and they're getting showered with money, whereas they get nothing. I can understand that like the Geelong, Melbourne, not fast train, but faster train. People in Bendigo, Ballarat, Shepparton say, well, hang on. It's that kind of thing that gives people like... it started with Susanna Sheed, I think, in the Victorian election, the one before last, when she identified that issue in Shepparton and said, make this seat marginal, and then you'll get the attention. She proved her case, and now I think independents everywhere are taking up the same call.
Susan in Eltham, morning to you.
Oh, good morning. I'm still upset about Angus Taylor getting 20 million and 80 million for nothing. And the water...
Sorry, whoa, Susan, he didn't.
He didn't get anything. He was connected with a company that eventually, but then left that company, and then that company got a benefit.
And you're talking about the money for the water buybacks that went through the Cayman Islands. He was not personally benefiting from that deal at all, Susan, and that's an important correction that we must immediately make.
You gave the family money for nothing, 80 million.
No, he wasn't. He helped establish the company, and then he left the company.
Though.
They left the company.
No, it wasn't his family.
And later they benefited, the company benefited, but Barry, he'd already, by that time, severed his ties.
Yeah, and I don't think his family had any connection with that, ongoing connection with that company either. But that was one of the stories that broke through all the kind of management on the part of the major parties. That, and I think that Daily Telegraph story was another example.
The one about about Bill's mum.
When they went after Bill Shorten via his mother. They're the two stories that sort of threw them off their campaign strategies for a day or two. But that Murray-Darling story, it's even though you sort of the point directly about Angus Taylor is not correct. That story though did have an impact, and I think it certainly hurt the National Party. Look, that was just way too much money for no return or very little return.
Text messages. Several people saying the Labor Party do have plans to reform family trusts, if you look into the detail. Why is national debt not an issue, says Marty in research. Do other media ever call out their News Corps colleagues over their partisan behaviour? Oh, by golly, do we what? On this program we have, and I'm not the only one. Morrison changed the rules so they could use incumbency money, claims Robin. I'm not aware of that. Barry, it's always been the advantage of incumbency, has it not? To be able to use your funds and use your electoral allowance and the like?
Yes, but any member of Parliament can do that, no matter what side you're on. In opposition, the rules are the same as in government. And
Paul in Dandenong, good morning to you.
Yeah, how you going? Just wondering about the day after, or the weeks after the election. We're fully aware of what Labor are going to do. It's all their policies, yada, yada, yada. But what's the legislative priorities? What actually the Liberals going to do come Monday, if you wind the clock back, they only had, half a dozen days or so that they put on the calendar.
Well, Barry put that very question to Josh Frydenberg on air, and his answer was?
It wasn't all that elaborate.
He said, we'll implement our budget plan, we'll spend more money on hospitals, we'll spend more money on schools, we'll bring about our business tax cuts.
Having said that, the budget...
He went back to the budget.
But going back to the budget is a reasonable approach for Josh Frydenberg to take. When you consider the polls a week before the budget were 54 Labor, 46 Coalition, it's not that anymore. It's tightened considerably on that. So you have to accept that this strategy of putting the budget out there immediately before an election did actually work.
Alrighty, let's grab a few more calls, and then Debbie Enker coming in after the 10 o'clock news. And the big issue in footy has been in television has been the demise of the Footy Show. So we'll workshop that with Debbie Enker. That's coming up after the news. Sarah's in Sindel. Morning to you, Sarah.
Oh, hi there, Barry. Hi, John. Love your program. I have a question for Barry. Do you think climate change will ever stop becoming a ping-pong game for the parties, and they eventually reach a bipartisan approach to climate change, and the agreement has longevity, and it no longer becomes a political issue?
Wouldn't that be a wonderful outcome? I'm still... Look, I'm not optimistic for this reason. When the NEG, the National Energy Guarantee, came up, and Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister and Josh Frydenberg was running the policy, it went through the party room several times. Had it gone to the Parliament for a vote, I think something like 140 out of 150 would have supported it. 10 would not have supported it, and they would have been the 10 dissidents from the Liberal Party, from the right wing, who would have broken away and made their statement. Because the Liberal Party couldn't allow that to happen, they didn't want to see that visual impact of being split over climate change, they backed away and didn't put it to the Parliament at all. So when you've got a policy that I think has the support of 140 out of 150 in the Parliament, and you can't get that through, I tell you, the future's not optimistic at all.
Several texters saying that our dismissal of concerns over the water buyback money going to the Cayman Islands is inappropriate.
Well, we're not dismissing it. We're saying that Angus Taylor did not stand to benefit.
And several people saying, well, unless we know who is the beneficial owner of the Cayman Islands tax haven secret company, we can't know who got the benefit of the money because it's through a tax haven, the Cayman Islands, and we don't know who. We don't know where the money.
There's a lot to be concerned about.
We don't know where the money went.
Saying that Angus Taylor had severed his links with the company.
Alrighty, and just very briefly, John's in Maidstone. Morning, John. You'll be our last caller.
Thank you, John. Considering I'm talking to, probably in my opinion, the two most respected and trusted journalists in our country, and you both seem to be winding it up at the ABC at around about the same time, does this mean you'll be joining forces and starting your own political party? Perhaps you could call it the Democratic Sausage Party.
Not for the faint-hearted.
Oh, very good. Well, I can rule out my contribution. I don't know about Barry. You can speak for yourself.
I've been doing that for 60 years, and I'll still continue to rule it out. I think
good on you,
as a 10-year-old.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody. We'll see what happens on Sunday morning on Insiders on ABC TV. But it's news time now on ABC Radio Melbourne. It's 10 o'clock.
Good morning, Tim Callanan with ABC News.